What you've just described is something I hear so often, that it's not, the straw that broke the camel's back is not often objectively the worst traumatic experience that they've been exposed to or had to deal with, but somehow breaks the whole system, right, or breaks the floodgates open.
What happens when the worst moments of other people's lives become just a normal part of your job? If you've ever asked yourself that, or if you know someone in a similar position, this episode is for you. Welcome to Let's Unpack with Black Dog Institute, the series where we take the questions people are genuinely asking about mental health and hand them to the researchers who are actually studying them. Today we're getting into something that doesn't get talked about nearly enough: what repeated exposure to trauma does to people whose job it is to keep our community safe. We're talking about first responders, emergency workers, and anyone who carries other people's hardest moments as part of their working life. Dr. Andrea Arena, a researcher in the workplace mental health team at Black Dog Institute, and Susanna Azevedo, a clinical psychologist and researcher at the UNSW Traumatic Stress Clinic. My name is Dr. Tara Lal. I'm a former firefighter and the emergency service lead at Black Dog Institute, which means I spend a lot of time connecting the research to the reality. Let's unpack that. So I wanted to start with something that I think is so important and so often really misunderstood by people, and that's the difference between trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. So Andrew, I wanted to ask you, from your perspective, can you explain to me the difference between trauma and PTSD?
Yeah, so I guess trauma involves experiencing a seriously distressing event, right? That's going to have an enduring impact on someone. And I guess one thing that I think is often overlooked as well is that resilience in the face of these events is actually the norm. Like most people won't go on to develop PTSD, but some people will. And so the marker at which it becomes, I guess, well, the thing to note is that PTSD is a mental health condition. And so that means it reaches a threshold where the effects on the person are now impacting their daily life. It's a seriously distressing issue that might impact their functioning in social situations or at work or in other places as well. But in terms of further differentiating that difference, I think Susanna would have a really good insights into that.
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, so I guess in common language, we often hear people talking about trauma. And if I'm thinking about it from a psychology perspective, trauma is an experience and an event that has happened that is either life-threatening or something that is threatening to somebody's moral integrity. And this traumatic event then leads people to have a whole host of different experiences. And as Andrew rightfully said, for most people, they are able to move on from that traumatic event. They get really good support from friends and family. They're able to process the event that happened. It's quite extraordinary. And over time, they're able to move forward with their lives. Now, post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, is one mental health condition that can develop following a traumatic event. And this is a mental health disorder or condition. And so what that means is that the brain is still thinking or processing that traumatic event as if it's happening in the present moment, where it believes that the threat situation that happened is in the present as opposed to it being in the past. And so that's when you see things like people having what we call intrusive memories of the traumatic event, where people want to be avoiding those memories or experiences or things that remind them of that. And then their nervous system becomes really activated and really sensitive. And so you see a lot of the times, and particularly with first responders, where they're very vigilant to their surroundings and threats in the environment. And so I'd say that's the difference between those two.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think it's such an important question because so often those two words have become so synonymous and people don't know the difference. So it's really interesting. And I know someone explained it to me once that, trauma isn't the event itself, it's our response to that event. And so it's such a uniquely individual experience. And I think that really helped me to understand more about my reaction to that, and that, the same event wasn't necessarily traumatic to everybody in the same way. It was something that really came to me. So just to follow on from that, can you explain a bit more, Susanna, about what happens kind of physically and psychologically? You kind of referred to that in terms of, the sorts of sensations that people get in their body, but what happens to people physically and psychologically after they've been exposed to a traumatic event?
Sure. So in the immediate aftermath of a traumatic event, it's really quite normal for our brains to try to want to make sense of what's just happened, right? Because often it's this really intense experience that if we could choose, we would probably never experience again. And so what the brain does is that it keeps reminding us of that experience, and it keeps popping up into that person's mind in either, a memory form or in certain kind of perceptual form. So it could be experiences within the person's body that reminds them of that time. It could be visual memories, it could be audio memories. And over time, that subsides. So as we start to make sense of that experience, for most people that will reduce. Now, for a small subset of people, that exposure to the traumatic event or an accumulation of exposures, as in first responders, that subside effect doesn't happen. And so then what tends to happen is we want to start to avoid having that experience because it's so unpleasant. And in that avoidance, what we're doing is we're learning that we're not really coping with that experience. And so then a whole other subset of things start to happen, like it's really difficult for us to concentrate on day-to-day things because we're so preoccupied or getting these intrusive kind of experiences. It affects our sleep quite poorly. And again, with first responders and being on a rotating roster, sleep is already quite a difficult challenge. And we start to become really hyper aware of our environment. Now, again, with first responders, it's so common, right? This is trained, this hyper awareness, because you have to be so vigilant to your surroundings and what might be threatening in the environment. Now, when you've got your uniform on, that's so useful. And when you don't have your uniform on, it's less useful in day-to-day kind of life. But it's very difficult to switch that off. And so if a lot of your energy is going into naturally scanning the environment, and finding things that perhaps other people may not be paying attention to as unsafe, then it's really difficult to feel within your body and within the environment that it is actually safe to be there.
Yeah, it's so interesting. It really speaks to, my experience of when, we're responding to sirens all the time. And so our nervous systems go all the way on and all the way off all the time. So it just becomes a very normal way of being. And everything that you're describing really kind of reinforces that and really helps, I think, for me and hopefully other people to understand what actually happens physiologically to us when we're exposed to what becomes really quite normal for us on a day-to-day basis. And I know, Andrew, you've done a lot of research around, that kind of the impact of repeated exposure to trauma. So it'd be really interesting to hear from a research perspective what you found in your research on what happens to people when they're repeatedly exposed to these types of trauma.
Yeah, well, firstly, just going back to what Susanna was saying, I think one way to think of the effects on people is that with these repeated intrusive reminders of stressful events or traumatic events, you kind of get stuck in survival mode in a way, right? And so if you're always being brought back to that event, then your nervous system is always going to be just totally elevated. And so that's when we get these physical type effects of anxiety. So muscle tension, poor sleep, and, even gastrointestinal symptoms. And I think, you can imagine dealing with that in day-to-day would wear you down. And then coupled with a lack of sleep, you can see how this is going to start feeding into all aspects of a person's life. And that is kind of what we see. When those events are cumulative and someone is repeatedly exposed to these sorts of situations, we know that does increase the risk of a trauma becoming PTSD. And first responders are extremely resilient. Having dealt with so many of these events on a day-to-day basis, it is part of their daily life. And so they are really resilient. But over years of exposure, it can gradually increase the risk. And so that's why we often do actually see quite high prevalence in retired or resigned first responders as well. And I think they're a often forgotten group that we really need to remember. We know that the longer you're on the job, the greater the risk of developing PTSD. And some work done at Black Dog Institute showed that after about 10 years of being on the job, then the rates of being diagnosed with PTSD is going to be a lot higher. And so it's just something that we need to be conscious of, and that first responders and organizations need to be conscious of, that there is this risk and that we need to be preparing people sufficiently and just making sure that they have all the supports they need.
You know, one of the things that I find really interesting, and I think people would be really interested to understand, is that so mostly people tend to think of trauma and they think of one particular incident that causes people to, you know, that marks a turning point and causes people to become unwell. And what I found with my colleagues is that because it's that repeated exposure, you often don't notice that you're becoming unwell. And so it'd be really good to understand, and maybe you can answer this, Susanna, as to, you know, what is it, how does repeated exposure differ, or is there a difference to when people have one particular, you know, exposure to an event that makes them become unwell? Is it almost harder when there's that repetitive exposure?
That's a really good question. And I think that often it depends, but I wonder with first responders where there is this mentality of this is just part of the job, right? It's just an organisational hazard, and therefore there's almost this underlying rule or expectation where I'm supposed to be more resilient to this. And if they can think about, well, this is one job that I'm going to and I'm not affected by that and I'm fine, then I can file that away and move on, so to speak. The trouble with that is that there are just so many different human experiences that they're exposed to. You know, they go from one job to another, and there's not much calibration time outside of being on the job to really think about or process what's happened. And so, you know, I can understand this idea of not wanting to be affected by it or not being allowed to be affected by it, and also the idea that we're feeling fine because you just have to get on with the next one and there's not much time to think about the previous one. But then the emotions are the same, I think. So even though if the job might be different, the emotional experience of that is still the same. And if you have to repeatedly over time switch off your emotion to deal with it, I think that takes a toll.
Yeah, that's so interesting, because one of the things that I really noticed is how good we get as first responders at suppressing our emotion. And it becomes a really normal way of being, because when we go to a job, we have to be task focused. We can't allow emotion to come in order to do our job effectively and safely.
Of course.
And so that just becomes a really learned way of being,
Yes.
to kind of keep my emotions down, to suppress. And no one ever teaches us how to kind of engage with our emotions after the job and kind of reflect on, oh, what did that mean for me? And so to kind of remove ourselves from our emotions becomes really, really normal for us. And I think what I've seen in myself and in other colleagues is that then it kind of builds up, but because you're not in tune necessarily with your body, you don't notice that it's building up. And I used to be a physiotherapist a long time ago, and it reminds me of when people would come in and they'd say, oh, but I played sport for years and years and years, but then I bent down to put my sock on and my back went and then I couldn't move. And I think for many first responders, that's their experience of trauma, because they don't realise that it's building up. So it's hard to understand, and that almost makes it worse, because if we can pin it to a particular event, it's sort of, we can understand it a bit more and kind of be a bit more compassionate towards ourselves. But because we go, but I've dealt with this and this and this over years and I was absolutely fine, and then I went to this little job, like for me I went to a really innocuous job and I had a huge response that was physical, like I literally felt like I was going to vomit, and it actually tied back to kind of old trauma for me, but I didn't realise that at the time. And you know, I was just like, what is happening? I had no kind of concept, and I didn't understand that what I had experienced was trauma, and this is why it was coming out really physically for me at that point, in that I've literally felt like I was going to vomit at a particular job that kind of reminded me of an old memory that had been really quite traumatic for me. So I think that really does us damage.
That's so common. Like what you've just described is something I hear so often, that it's not, you know, the straw that broke the camel's back is not often objectively the worst traumatic experience that they've been exposed to or had to deal with, but somehow breaks the whole system, right, or breaks the floodgates open. And so I just want to say that's really common, and lots of first responders say that to me in my clinical practice. And there's a lot of self-judgment, I think, that comes from that. So I think it's important to normalise that that is a very common process. It also can happen that, you know, you're fine for a really long time, and then 5-10 years down the track, all of a sudden you have all of these traumatic symptoms or PTSD kind of symptoms. And often I get asked, you know, well, why is it happening now? Like, I thought I had dealt with it, I was fine. There's this like delayed response which can happen as well. So all part of common experiences.
Yeah, and that really speaks to your research, Andrew, around what happens to people and rates of PTSD when people retire from the emergency services. And so, yeah, can you speak a little bit more or describe to me the research and what you found?
Yeah, so what we found is that from all the available evidence that we could find on studies that have reported on the prevalence of PTSD, is that rates of PTSD are higher in retired or resigned first responders than they are in active first responders. And there are so many reasons for that. But speaking to a point that was raised just then, around, you know, like you said, like you don't always notice what's happening with your own emotions at the time. I think first responders are so good at staying in control that it's often not until someone else close to them notices that something's wrong that they actually do seek help, or you know, that makes them realize that, hey, you know, maybe I need to address something. And that is often what we see in retired first responders, is that once the daily adrenaline and putting on the uniform and going to work and having your, you know, your purpose sort of, once you stop going into work and there's not that constant purpose and adrenaline driving you and things slow down, then what often gets reported is that people start to see old traumas resurface, and you do start to have that time and space now that you are dealing with your emotions. And yeah, that's when I think a lot of people do realize there's a lot of stuff I haven't processed. And so symptoms of PTSD can rise at that point. And again, it just shows how this is a really important group to be considering when we think about how we reach people who are in need.
Yeah, absolutely. And I certainly found that from my own experience. I was so kind of shocked by the impact that leaving the service had on me. And I thought that was absolutely fine. And suddenly, you know, that whole sense of identity, and it was kind of very subtly mixed in with probably a cumulative trauma, but it didn't really seem obvious that it was that. And I think one of the things that's often missed as well is that people are equally as likely, and perhaps you can talk more to me about this, but that people are equally trauma, and for me it was that way, actually is just as likely to manifest itself as depression or anxiety or in as it is in PTSD, because from my own experience, I don't actually have a diagnosis of PTSD, but I often say that every aspect of my life has been impacted by trauma, but my response to that trauma, it played out more as probably mixed depression, anxiety, and attachment kind of issues and relational kind of issues. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, Susanna.
Yeah, sure. And Tara, I think that's a really good point, because, you know, that's why it's helpful to delineate that, you know, the difference between trauma and a traumatic event versus post-traumatic stress disorder, because post-traumatic stress disorder is one way that we can respond to these experiences that we've had. And there are also people who might develop depression. There are people who might develop an anxiety disorder in absence of intrusive experiences and symptoms. So there are many different ways that traumatic events can affect us, including resilience as well, like Andrew was talking about before. I think that it comes back to this idea of what do we do? How do we make sense of these life experiences? How do we make sense of our emotions related to that? And so, you know, if I think back to what Andrew was saying around once you transition out of that workforce, then all of a sudden you're not being exposed to those traumatic events anymore. So you're not currently facing and having to deal with those things, but then you're also having to sit with a lot of time and grappling things like your sense of self and identity, and then all these emotions that have been buried for such a long time. That is so functional when you're on the job. I just want to stress that it's really important to know that that is a useful, like what an intelligent thing to do as a first responder, to switch off your emotions when you're having to deal with these life-threatening events or with public members who are really distressed. I think that's really intelligent. I think where it then trips us up is if we continue to switch off those emotions. It's what we do when we're not facing these emergency situations that really count, and perhaps is a way that we can start mitigating or start changing the way that we are accumulatively impacted by the traumatic events.
You know, what I so often hear from first responders, and I know is the case, is that it's their family members often who are the people that notice that something's wrong or that person's different, especially, you know, in terms of maybe their sleep or they're having nightmares or, you know, those things that kind of make them realise often before the person themselves realise. So in that case, what can you suggest if I was a family member and I was worried about my partner or my spouse who was a first responder? Can you give us some tips or explain or describe what might be a way to support someone?
I think that's a great question, Tara, and I just want to shout out to the family members who refer their loved ones to seek help, because they are the biggest champions of that person in getting support. And I know with first responders, because often they're the ones, or not often, they are the ones that are, you know, running towards danger than away. They find that it's not okay for them to take up resources, or, you know, they're not allowed to seek help. And I think that's a huge barrier. So family members are often the ones that get people over the line. And what they find, I think, the family members are things like, you know, their loved one is really irritable, or they're not wanting to engage in regular activities, or they have this like heightened sense of safety that often then leads to fights within families. And so if you're a family member of a first responder and you're noticing your loved one is acting a bit, you know, irritable, or not enjoying things that they normally enjoy, or a bit more withdrawn, then I'd say get them to go and see their GP, their general practitioner. Get them to reach out to a psychologist, because there is really effective treatment that is available. That is hard work, but I know that first responders aren't shy from hard work, and that gets fantastic results. And I think, Andrew, you can speak to the results that we can get from treatment.
Yeah. So we know that effective treatments are available. And at Black Dog Institute, we have a National Emergency Worker Support Service. And as part of that, Suzanne is one of the clinicians that delivers, you know, care to first responders with PTSD. And so one treatment that's particularly effective in this group is trauma-focused CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy. And I guess another thing to note is that it's really important that these therapies are tailored in a way to the particular group, and that they feel relevant and right for the person. It uses the right language, and it's addressing, you know, the particular issues, because we know that being a first responder is a very specific experience. And what we found in the treatment we deliver is actually quite world-leading recovery rates. So 77% of clients do make a full recovery from PTSD, and the definition of recovery is not always black and white, but what I'm referring to here is no longer meeting the diagnostic criteria for PTSD. So 77% of people, that's actually really remarkable for psychology.
Yeah, and that's actually world leading, isn't it? I know that often kind of general rates, I think, you can maybe tell me around 50-60% recovery
yeah, about
for PTSD.
50%. Yeah.
So the outcomes that you're seeing in the traumatic stress clinic are really, you know, world leading. And I think what you said, Andrew, was so true. You know, in my experience, every first responder says, I just want to speak to somebody that gets it, that understands my world and understands the work that I do. And they all say that. So I think there's such an important part to be said for that kind of, for the clinicians to be familiar with working with emergency service workers and to understand our world. And I think that really has a huge impact. For us, I know, as people, that everybody says that they want to speak to somebody who gets kind of our world and why we're different. And also, I think what's really interesting, and you may be able to speak to this, Susanna, is how first responders and their when they present, say, with PTSD, are different to other trauma impacted populations, because I notice in being around firefighters that our anger is a huge thing that seems to be very, very prevalent as a way that kind of our responses to trauma kind of seems to come out as anger, and often lots of alcohol abuse as well, or alcohol use disorder. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on how maybe first responders are so different to other clients you might see with presenting with PTSD.
I think that's a really great question, and also we see that in the clinic, you know, that there are higher rates of anger issues, there are higher rates of substance use, and I think it all comes back to what is allowed to be felt and what is not allowed to be felt. And so anger feels like a more powerful emotion, it's more seen as more acceptable than sadness, fear, shame, guilt, right? Those are heavier, perhaps perceived as weaker emotions. And then with substance use, it's a way of regulating, right? It's a way of suppressing the emotions that are bubbling away underneath it all. And so we very commonly see higher rates of substance use because of that. Now, in terms of the population being different to a civilian population, there are a few ways, and one of those ways is even just the way that first responders deal with these traumatic events. You know, there's a lot of dark humour, for example, that first responders use, and if you can understand that as a clinician and harness that, I think it goes a long way to disarming that feeling of standoffishness, you know, a feeling of, you know, sussing your clinician out to make sure that they can get it, right? Because why am I going to waste my time opening up with you if you don't get my experiences? So I think dark humour is a really good way of finding an inroad with that.
Absolutely. You don't want to know some of the humour that we use to cope, but it's a really effective coping mechanism, I think.
Absolutely.
And do you think as a clinician that is actually a helpful way? Is it an adaptive way to cope using that dark humour?
I think it's maybe not as black and white. I think absolutely, and like any kind of coping strategy, you know, and I think the key here is being flexible with our coping strategies. Our coping strategies are really helpful. I don't want to say that avoidance, for example, is unhelpful all of the time, or dark humour is unhelpful all of the time. You know, I think it's actually a very clever way of reducing the distress that we're feeling, or reducing the intensity. It's like putting down the heat on the stove, right? It's if we're using that all of the time and only, then things like dark humour maybe, or avoidance, or using substances, that all can become an issue. So I think it comes back to that idea of being flexibly able to apply different kinds of strategies at times where it's important to. So when you're, you know, at the fire station after a job, or as you're dealing with it, dark humour is really important and helpful. If you use that with a family member, they may not appreciate that kind of humour, and so you might need to switch gears and change things up.
Yeah, that's really interesting, actually. And it reminds me of something you said earlier, Andrew, in relation to control, and what you were saying, Susanna, just then about flexibility, because one of the things that I noticed is because we work in a command and control environment, and it's very hierarchical, and then we're also, because we are kind of a trauma impacted population, it changes our relationship to control. So we actually like to have control. We have a heightened need for control, if you like.
Absolutely.
But we also work within organisations which by their nature divest us of control, and so there's this kind of tension there, and it kind of limits our ability to have kind of a psychological flexibility, which I think, and I know we're doing some work at the moment at Black Dog Institute around developing psychological flexibility. And I'd love to hear, Andrew, from you what the research says around developing psychological flexibility and how that can help emergency service workers.
When we think about, you know, this, you know, investment in being in control and all the other things that come along with the first responder culture, I think there's a lot about these things that are actually getting in the way of first responders seeking help, right? And I think that there's a lot of stigma around mental health in the first responder community, where, you know, needing help is seen as a weakness, or, you know, is undesirable because it means, you know, I'm not in control of my emotions, or whatever else it is.
Or I'll let I'll let my colleagues down. You know, if I have a mental health issue, that means that I can't stand with my colleagues and help them out. They're not going to trust me anymore to do the thing that I need to do. And I think that's a real barrier to people help seeking.
Yeah, it's a huge barrier, I think, that sense. And, you know, that kind of self-stigma, like I should be able to cope.
Yep.
You know, there's a lot of colleagues said to me once, you know, there's a lot of shoulds when you're a firefighter. I should be this and I should be that. And that perception of the uniform and what we're supposed to be. Yeah. And one of them is, I'm the rescuer. One of them said to me, I'm always the rescuer, I'm never the rescuee.
Yes.
And I think that really speaks to that, you know, it's not okay for me to ask for help, and it's definitely not okay for me to show vulnerability. And as you said, Andrew, to show emotion feels very risky. To if I let that emotion up, what's going to happen? And am I going to lose control? Yeah. And that is incredibly frightening for, you know, a first responder or for a firefighter. And when I think back to my own experiences, you know, which were probably layered trauma from childhood and then going into emergency service work, and kind of that sense of threat to my sense of safety in the world and not feeling safe, and then trying to find different ways to be able to control that so that I felt like I had some control and felt safe. And it would be great to hear from you, actually, if you could explain or describe from a clinician's perspective, you know, how do you work with people so that they develop that sense of safety?
That's a great question. So I guess there are a few ways that we do that. And the model that I primarily work out of is what Andrew mentioned before, which is trauma-focused cognitive behavior therapy. And so, you know, if we think about cognitive behavior therapy, there are the thoughts, those are the cognitions. So people's sense of safety often around things like their capacity to control the environment. It might be around their perceived sense of threat or danger that's in the environment that we can then look at and think, you know, how effective is it for me to be engaging in this kind of thought? Is there real truth to this? Because often we don't really question our thoughts. They happen so automatically. And then the other way we do it is through behaviors, right? So the things that we're doing in our environment that maybe maintain these thoughts about our sense of safety being threatened in the world. And one really big thing that maintains that is avoidance. So if we're avoiding situations, places, things that are reminders or I guess in common language now triggers to these traumatic experiences, then what we're doing is we're not allowing ourselves to have new relationships, new memories with that environment. And then we're also, by virtue of that, telling ourselves unconsciously that we can't cope in those experiences unless we have everything under control, unless we have, which by the way is completely an illusion. You know, we can't control everything. But it makes us feel safer. It makes us feel like we are able to get on with the things that we're doing. And the world can become really small.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's what I kind of noticed, in myself and in other colleagues was, you know, how the more I tried to control the world around me to make me feel safe, the smaller my life got. And in the end, I realised, you know, for me, the only way through it was to turn into it, but in a kind of supported way, so that I could gradually start to expand my world and start to feel safe with uncertainty and not knowing. And I think one of the biggest things that's been helpful for me is to, you know, through lots of work, as you said, through really putting in the work. And I think, like as you said, first responders want to work. They want to be given something specific to do. That's how we think. You know, like they want tasks to do, and they want
give me a roadmap.
Exactly. Tell me what to do, and I'm going to do it. You know, and I think putting in all that work to just very gradually kind of re-network those pathways in my brain and in my body to enable me to sit with not knowing and uncertainty, and in a way to embrace a bit of chaos and be okay with that. But to do that, I had to find that inside me first to be able to feel a bit more solid and lots of emotional regulation and now kind of regulating my emotion and doing meditation and mindfulness and all of those things are just part of my daily life, which help me to kind of feel a little bit more solid, to be able to feel a little bit more safe, to be able to put myself in these situations which I used, you know, find confronting and challenging and difficult. So we've talked a lot about kind of the accumulative impact of trauma and PTSD and how it impacts us psychologically and physically. I've got a question from somebody who's written in from the community, and what they've asked is, my partner just refuses to seek help and is kind of avoidant. What can I do about it? So
Well,
I'm going to throw to you, Andrew.
Yeah, I think a really, if the issue is starting that conversation, a really good way into that conversation is by talking about what you've noticed, changes in behaviors that you've noticed. So it could be, look, I've noticed that you don't want to go out anymore, or you used to really enjoy that, or I've noticed that you're really snappy these days. Like, can we just have a second and talk about it? That can be a really good way just to start that conversation. And from there, you can sort of start to, slowly unpack, do you think maybe, your work is starting to, have a bit of an impact? And from there, I think you can suggest, a great first step for seeking help is to see your GP. And so you can sort of lead someone to that point. But yeah, would you add anything to that?
Andrew, I think that's a great response. If you can start a conversation in a observational way, where maybe you're using terms like your behavior-based terms. I've noticed that you're not really coming out so much anymore, or I've noticed that things are wearing you down a bit more, or you seem stressed, what can we do about it? How can I support you? It also takes a village. So can we get, that person's social network involved and get them checking in a little bit more than usual, helping them along the way to get to their GP or to a service like ours.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, Andrew, didn't want to interrupt.
Okay. I think that so much of the reluctance to acknowledge what someone is experiencing and to seek help comes from that sense of, needing help is a weakness or a vulnerability. I think we really need to be, and this is beyond just first responders, but as a society, we really need to be shifting that mentality, because seeking help does take strength. It is a strong thing to do. And I think that if we can frame things in that way, that listen, this might be hard, but, and it takes some strength, but it's really important. Because first responders, it's so important for them to be there for their family, for their colleagues, for others. And to do that, you need to, be able to stand up and look after yourself first.
Yeah.
Can I jump in here? Often it's that it's the impact on their family members that motivates them to finally take that step. And so I completely agree, Andrew. I mean, it's so important to take care of yourself, to be available and connected with your family members, but it's their love and devotion for their family members that are then the impetus, the things that make them want to go and seek help because of the impact on them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, as you said, we know that the ability to ask for help is a key factor in resilience. So exactly as you said, Andrew, it's such an important part of resilience is that ability to seek help, but we need to change that narrative, and I think it is slowly changing, but less so for first responders, and I think I've certainly found that actually my own strength came through leaning into my vulnerability rather than pretending that I didn't have it. And I think reflecting back on what we were saying about family, that sometimes, I know we did a study quite a while ago with firefighters, and it showed that I think 87% of firefighters are going to turn to their peer in the first instance that they're struggling. So I think also sometimes it isn't the family member isn't the best person to have that conversation. But if you can engage peers, sometimes that can also be a way in, or another way in, to facilitate people to take that first step, because I find that lots of firefighters especially, or first responders, are really frightened of what does a first appointment with a psychologist look like, and does that mean I'm crazy, or does that mean something's really wrong with me, or maybe, and so in fact maybe you can speak to that. I think it'd be really interesting for people, Susanna, to explain from a clinician's perspective, what does a first appointment with a psychologist look like, and it might really help people to maybe be less afraid of what that means to see someone.
So yeah, I think the first appointment is really just getting to know one another, thinking about that person as they exist as a whole, and then talking about their experiences and the way that their experiences are shaping them, but also how they're impacting them now. So a first appointment with a clinician looks like a clinician asking a whole bunch of questions and getting a sense for that person. And it's also an opportunity for the first responder or the person coming to see a clinician to also suss out the clinician and think whether that's a good fit for them, because that's important too.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think that's often, and that can often be, that's where that cultural piece comes in, understanding, because I think, if you don't connect with that person, and I certainly found that I have seen a psychologist in the past where I was like, it just didn't click for whatever reason. And I think that it's good for people to know and to expect that not everybody's going to be the right fit, and that you can go and see someone, and if it doesn't feel like the right fit, that's okay, and that you can then go and see somebody else. And I think that's helpful for people to know that you don't always connect with the first person you see, but you just don't want it to put people off. Another question that has come in from the community is, why is it that I feel numb? And what does that mean if I just don't feel anything? And I think that in my experience, that's quite a common experience for many first responders, that they just don't feel anything. And so, and what do you do about it if that's, and it'd be great to hear your
Great question, community member. Excellent question. So numbness comes from that sense of detaching from your emotional experiences, which, as we've discussed, is a really helpful functional strategy when you're on the job and attending things that you need to attend to. The problem with that is that we're not able to completely only isolate certain emotions, right? So when we switch off emotional experiences, we switch off from all of our emotional experiences. And that's where the numbness comes in, where over time, if we're getting used to and in the habit of switching off our feelings, then it means that it's harder to switch them back on in day-to-day life. The second part of that question is, what do I do about that? Well, it's little and often. So being able to slowly engage with things that perhaps are less threatening, so maybe more positive experiences, and being able to mindfully tune into how that feels, how that sits. And over time, getting good practice with that, so that you're more and more likely to open up to other kinds of experiences, including the negative emotions that are so important to address.
Yeah. And I think that there is a skill to doing that. And it does take practice. And so things like mindfulness, like you mentioned, can really help to get used to that as becoming second nature, to take a second to tune in. Even just that moment to be self-aware and to realize, like, hey, like, I am feeling numb right now. And just stepping back and coming back into your body. I think, it just, you have to be, I guess, ready to start taking notice and ready to start putting some of those skills into practice, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting what you said about that kind of graded exposure, that for many first responders, actually, it's more difficult to sit still and to sit and to even to meditate is actually can be quite triggering in itself, because and so when people start to feel, especially, it's like, oh my God, I actually find it really difficult to sit still. So what would you suggest for people that are maybe experiencing that kind of thing, where actually sitting still becomes quite difficult, and doing some of the things that we know are helpful, like mindfulness and meditating and those sorts of things?
We don't have to be still in order to be present. I think that's one thing to say. And another is that it's helpful to learn that our emotions are not a threat, right? That our emotions are okay. No feeling is final. Any feeling that we have will pass. And so getting used to being able to practice that in multiple ways, not just through meditation, can be helpful.
Mindfulness doesn't have to look like, sitting in your chair and meditating like a monk. You can do almost anything mindfully.
Yeah, that's such a good point. That's such a good point, Andrew. I think, many first responders would find it much more natural to practice mindfulness while
moving,
fishing, or walking, or something like that. So someone's asked here, and they've said, I'm scared that if I open up about my mental health at work, it will affect my job. So is there anywhere for me to go?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And a really common experience. We know that a big reason why a lot of first responders don't seek help is because there's a fear that they'll be taken away from the job that is so important to them and so central to who they are. And so I do think that private ways of seeking help, confidential ways, are really crucial. So yes, while a lot of first responders will really benefit from seeking help from their peers and looking to the supports that are available through their workplace, and they can have their place and are helpful. For a lot of people, there is a real need to seek help from a service that feels very independent. And they are out there. Black Dog Institute has a service called the National Emergency Worker Support Service at the moment, which does offer that confidential, independent care that's really very much evidence-based, and so it can be trusted on that level. Susanna, would you add to that?
I would just add that fear of it affecting their work. I mean, if they are already fearing that it'll affect their work, potentially it is. And the longer that you go without seeking help, the worse it becomes. And if we can be really proactive about it and go and seek that support in the first instance, then you're setting yourself up for more longevity in your workplace, which, like Andrew was saying, is so important. So seeking confidential help, which is available outside of the workplace, like at the Traumatic Stress Clinic and Black Dog Institute, is a great way of doing that.
So I wanted to ask, and probably to you, Susanna, in the first instance, somebody here has asked, why do certain memories pop up out of nowhere and feel so intense?
So the short answer to that is because it's stored in a part of the brain that's separate to the regular memory bank of the brain, and it's an unprocessed or raw format. So the way I like to explain it to people is that it's almost like sitting in a file out at reception, whereas our other memories, our day-to-day regular kind of memories or things that we've processed, are sitting in a filing cabinet tucked away. And so that memory that is sitting in the file at reception is just desperately wanting your attention so that it gets addressed and is able to move into the filing cabinet. And so that's why there are some memories that keep popping up. But I would say there are also memories that we have reminders for that are non-threatening or non-traumatic, right? So if I walk past a jasmine bush, for example, I think about my grandmother and memories that I have with her in her garden. And that's a normal part of memories and a normal part of our memory experience.
Yeah,
thank you. Do you have anything to add to that, Andrew?
Not so much. I mean, intrusive memories are exactly that. Like, they're intrusive. They can come out of nowhere. But like you said about, like the jasmine bush, if there's any particular thing that is a reminder of the event, then that can trigger these feelings. And I guess when you're working... when your workplace is the reminder, then that can become really hard to avoid. And you can see how it can bleed into someone's life. If you're attending traffic accidents, and then you're traveling to work on that same road, that can be really hard to grapple with.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think when I first learned that this kind of primal fear response part of our brain, that it was just activated and that it was a physiological thing that was happening to me, and it was related to, it was like a kind of confused memory, if you like, and it wasn't a memory that was stored in a different way. And when someone explained to me that was really helpful, and I love that. I had heard that analogy before as well about, taking a book off the bookshelf and being able to take the bookshelf off when you choose to, once you start to understand it more and that memory, and then being able to put the book back on the shelf again, rather than it coming at you kind of so intrusively when you're not expecting it from these kind of external visual or smelling kind of triggers. And I think that it's so helpful to have those kind of metaphors to help us understand what's actually happening. And I think it takes a lot of the stigma away for it when people see it as that kind of something that's physiologically happening in their brain, rather than them being weak, and that's what's causing it. Well, thank you so much both. It's been such a fascinating conversation, and I think we could have talked for kind of hours and hours and hours about this, and I think probably the thing that that really I keep coming back to from today's conversation is just that difference between trauma and PTSD, and how they're different, and also what people can do about it, and that there's so much out there to support people that maybe, and hopefully help people understand a bit more about their experiences and where and how they can seek help, and to understand their experiences, which I think is so important. When people can understand their experiences, it's much easier for them to find a way through them. If anything we've talked about resonated with you or perhaps unsettled you, please head to the Black Dog Institute website on blackdoginstitute.org.au, where you'll find a whole load of resources and links, and please feel free to comment. We'd love to hear your questions and comments. Thanks for unpacking this with us. We'll see you at the next one.